Fix this engine, and maybe I'll marry you." The words didn't just land. They sliced clean through the polished silence of Langford Motors' flagship garage, sharp enough to make every wrench stop mid-turn and every breath hang just a second too long as the overhead lights reflected off chrome and glass like cold daylight trapped indoors. And for a moment, no one moved. Not the line of engineers in tailored jackets. Not the interns clutching tablets. Not even the camera drone hovering quietly near the ceiling streaming it all lived to half. The company, because the tone in Victoria Langford's voice wasn't playful, wasn't joking, it was measured, dismissive, practiced, the kind of tone that turned people into roles instead of names. And at the center of it all stood Marcus Hale, sleeves rolled, hands darkened with oil that traced the lines of his knuckles like proof of work no one in that room respected. His boots planted steady against the concrete floor as the key fob slid across the ground and stopped just short of his foot width. A faint metallic click that somehow sounded louder than it should have, louder than the quiet laughter that followed, louder than the whisper someone didn't quite hide. "He's just the mechanic." And Marcus didn't answer, didn't react the way they expected. No tight jaw, no defensive glance, just a slow breath that lifted his shoulders and settled again as if the air itself had weight. And then he bent down, picked up the keys, and turned toward the car without asking for permission, because permission was never something he had been given, only something he learned to work without. The hood lifting with a soft hydraulic sigh that exposed the machine beneath. A prototype engine still warm from failed attempts. Wires slightly out of alignment, housing scratched where tools had slipped. A problem labeled unsolvable by people who wore cleaner clothes than he did. And Victoria stepped closer, heels tapping once, twice, deliberate, controlled, her reflection faintly visible along the glossy curve of the car as she crossed her arms and watched him like someone watching a test she already believed had been failed. And somewhere behind her a voice muttered about deadlines and contracts, about how this one engine stood between the company and a deal worth more than most people in that room would see in a lifetime. But Marcus didn't look up, didn't ask questions. He just placed his hand lightly against the frame of the engine like he was listening to something deeper than sound, his fingers tracing along the edge of a misaligned plate, the scent of metal and heat rising into the air as he reached for a tool without turning his head, muscle, memory guiding him. And the room shifted in small ways, weight moving from one foot to another, a tablet lowering, a conversation dying before it finished, because something about the way he moved didn't match the story they had already written about him. Slow but certain, deliberate but unhurried, each motion connected to the next like he could already see the machine working even before it did. And Victoria's expression tightened just slightly, not enough for most to notice, but enough to register in the silence that followed, because silence had changed now. It wasn't mocking anymore, it was waiting, and Marcus leaned in a little closer, eyes scanning, breath steady, the faint hum of electricity lingering somewhere beneath the surface of the engine like a memory not yet gone. And for the first time since she spoke, Victoria didn't say another word, her confidence still there, but thinner now, stretched across something she didn't fully control, while Marcus adjusted one small component, then another, not rushing, not performing, just working, and the camera above them tilted slightly, as if even it needed a better angle to understand what was about to happen, because the moment had shifted without anyone announcing it. And Marcus Hale, the man they had reduced to a joke seconds ago, was no longer just fixing an engine. He was quietly rewriting the balance in the room one precise movement at a time. The first bolt came loose with a soft crack that echoed sharper than it should have, and Marcus did not pause to look around, did not check who was watching, because he already knew they were. He could feel it in the way the air had shifted behind him, tighter now, heavier. Like the room itself was holding its breath, and somewhere to his left a tablet chimed quietly as the live stream count ticked higher, drawing in more eyes, more judgment, more people ready to see him fail. But his hands did not rush. They moved with a rhythm that did not belong to pressure, fingers steady as he lifted a panel free and set it down with care, lining it up perfectly beside the others, as if even the smallest detail mattered. Because to him it did, always had, even when no one was watching, even when no one cared. And Victoria shifted her weight slightly, one heel turning inward just a fraction, her gaze narrowing as she leaned closer, not enough to admit curiosity, but enough that she could not look away, and the engine lay open now, its internal structure exposed in layers of metal and wiring that most people in the room only understood on screens, diagrams, simulations. But Marcus saw something different, something alive beneath the stillness, a pattern that had been interrupted, a sequence that had been forced out of alignment, and he reached in deeper, adjusting a connector with 2 fingers, then pausing, head tilted just slightly, as if listening for something no one else could hear, and a voice behind Victoria whispered, "He is going to make it worse." But no one said it loud enough to stop him, not anymore, because something about his calm made interruption feel like a mistake, and seconds stretched longer, each movement deliberate, each click of metal precise, until he did something that made 2 engineers exchange a quick glance. He began removing parts that had nothing to do with the original failure, pieces that had passed inspection, pieces that should not have been touched, and a quiet ripple of doubt moved through the room. Because now it looked like destruction, not repair, and Victoria's arms tightened across her chest, her posture sharpening as she finally spoke again. Her voice controlled but edged with impatience. "If you are dismantling it, you better have a reason." And Marcus did not answer, not because he did not hear her, but because the answer was already in his hands. He set one component aside and reached deeper into the core, adjusting a hidden alignment point buried beneath layers others had not thought to check. And when he pulled his hand back, there was a faint smear of oil across his wrist, catching the light in a dull shine. And for a moment he stilled again, not frozen, just focused, breathing steady as if the machine was breathing with him. And then he reached for a different tool, smaller, more precise, tightening something no one else in the room had noticed was loose, and the shift was almost invisible, but it changed everything. The angle, the tension, the balance, and even without understanding it, the people watching felt it. The quiet deepened, the doubts softened into something else, something closer to anticipation, and Victoria's expression flickered, just for a second, something unguarded passing through before she steadied herself again, because she was not used to being uncertain, not in her own space, not in front of her own people, and yet here she was, watching a man she had reduced to a joke move through a problem her entire team could not solve, and the distance between them, measured in a few feet of polished concrete, suddenly felt much larger, defined not by status or title, but by understanding, and Marcus reached for the ignition control, but did not press it yet, his hand hovering just above it, eyes scanning one last time, checking, confirming, and the entire room leaned into that moment without realizing it. Every breath aligned with his pause, every thought suspended on what he would do next, and still, he said nothing. His thumb hovered a fraction of an inch above the ignition control, not shaking, not hesitating, just waiting, and the waiting itself became louder than any sound in the room as the overhead lights hummed faintly and the livestream counter ticked up again, unseen but felt, and somewhere behind Victoria a chair shifted softly against the floor before going still again, as if even that small noise had overstepped. And Marcus exhaled slowly through his nose, eyes moving once more across the exposed engine, tracing every line, every connection, every adjustment he had made, because this was the part no one else understood, the moment before action where the outcome was already decided, and he had learned a long time ago that rushing this moment was how mistakes were born, so he gave it the time it deserved, even with dozens of eyes pressing in, even with the weight of someone else's doubts sitting just over his shoulder, and Victoria felt it too, that pause stretching longer than comfort allowed, her fingers tightening slightly against her arm as she spoke again, quieter this time but sharper. "If you are finished, then start it." And the command did not land the same way her first one had. It did not carry the same certainty, because now there was something beneath it, something closer to need, and Marcus finally lowered his hand, pressing the ignition, and for a split second nothing happened, no sound, no movement, just a stillness so complete it felt like the room had been emptied of air, and then a low vibration began, subtle at first, a quiet hum building from deep within the engine, rising steadily, smoothly, until it filled the space with a sound that was not just functional, but refined, balanced, alive in a way it had not been before, and the difference was immediate, undeniable, even to those who did not understand why, and heads lifted, Eyes widened, shoulders shifted as disbelief replaced expectation. And Marcus did not step back, did not look around for reaction. He simply listened, just like before, letting the sound settle, letting it prove itself, because the machine would always tell the truth if you knew how to hear it. And Victoria's posture changed almost imperceptibly, her weight shifting forward instead of back, her gaze fixed not on Marcus now, but on the engine itself, as if searching for a flaw that would restore the balance she had lost. But there was none, only the steady rhythm of something working exactly as it should, better than it had before, and one of her senior engineers stepped closer, drawn in despite himself, his hand hovering near the edge of the open frame before pulling back as if unsure he had the right to touch it, and his voice came out low, almost reluctant. "This is not just repaired." And he stopped there, because finishing the sentence would mean admitting more than he was ready to say. And Marcus reached in once more, making a small adjustment, not because it was necessary, but because it was right, tightening the final detail that completed the system. And then he stepped back, wiping his hands slowly on a worn cloth, the oil leaving dark streaks that caught the light in uneven lines. And only then did he look up, his expression unchanged, calm, grounded, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if this was simply the result of doing something the right way. And the room did not know how to respond, because the script they had expected had been broken without warning. And Victoria opened her mouth slightly as if to speak, then stopped, the words not forming the way they had before, because the space between them had shifted again, no longer defined by assumption, but by something far more difficult to control. And in the reflection of the polished surface beside her, she saw it clearly for the first time, not just the engine running, but the moment she had lost the certainty she had walked in with. And Marcus, already turning slightly away from the car, did not wait for her to find it again. The engine continued to hum, steady and controlled, a low, confident sound that filled the garage without asking for attention, and yet it held all of it, pulling every eye, every thought toward it, as if nothing else in the room mattered anymore. And Marcus stepped back one full pace, giving the machine space like it deserved, his hands resting at his sides, cloth still loosely gripped between his fingers as a thin line of oil traced down toward his wrist. And no one spoke, not immediately, because silence had changed again, no longer tense or doubtful, but uncertain in a different way, like a room that had just realized it had been wrong. And Victoria Langford stood still, her reflection fractured across the polished panels of the car, her posture still straight but no longer rigid, her arms slowly uncrossing as if the position no longer fit. And she took one step forward, then another, the sound of her heels softer now against the concrete as she approached the open hood, her eyes scanning the engine with a focus that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with understanding what she was seeing. And she leaned in slightly, close enough to feel the faint warmth rising from the system, close enough to hear the smooth rhythm that her own team had failed to achieve. And behind her someone cleared their throat but did not speak, because there was nothing left to say that would not sound smaller than the moment itself. And finally she straightened, turning her head just enough to look at Marcus without fully facing him, as if still deciding how to bridge the space that had opened between them. And her voice came out measured, controlled, but thinner than before. "It runs." And the words felt incomplete the second they left her mouth, like she already knew they were not enough. And Marcus gave a slight nod, not in agreement, not in pride, just acknowledgement, because the machine did what it was meant to do, and that was all that mattered to him. And one of the engineers stepped forward more boldly now, unable to hold back any longer, his eyes fixed on the engine as he spoke. "This configuration is different." And Marcus did not turn, did not explain, because explanation was not something he offered easily, not in rooms like this, not to people who had already decided who he was before he touched the car. And the engineer hesitated, then added more quietly, "It is better." And that word settled into the space between them with a weight no one ignored. And Victoria heard it. Of course she did. And something in her expression shifted again, more visible this time. A crack in the certainty she had carried so easily before. And she turned fully now, facing Marcus directly, her gaze searching his face for something she could recognize, something that fit into the structure she understood. But what she found was calm, steady, untouched by the moment in a way that unsettled her more than any reaction could have, and she took a breath, subtle but deliberate, as if preparing to say something that mattered, and for a second the room leaned toward her, waiting for the authority to return, for the balance to reset. But when she spoke, the words did not land with the same force. "You got lucky." And even she heard it, the weakness in the statement, the lack of conviction, and Marcus finally looked at her, not sharply, not with challenge, just directly, his eyes clear and quiet, and he shook his head once, small and simple. "Engines do not run on luck," he said, his voice even, unhurried, carrying just enough to be heard without pushing against the room, and the sentence lingered, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable in its truth, and no one moved to argue it. Not the engineers, not the interns, not even Victoria, because arguing would mean denying what was right in front of them. And Marcus turned then, reaching for his tools, placing each one back into its place with the same care he had used when he began, as if the moment itself did not require anything more from him. And that was when the senior engineer stepped closer to Victoria, his voice low but urgent now, leaning just enough that only she could hear, and whatever he said caused her shoulders to still completely, her expression freezing for a fraction of a second before she looked back at Marcus with something new in her eyes, something that had not been there before, not curiosity, not doubt, but recognition beginning to form. The words from the senior engineer did not travel far, but they carried weight, enough to shift something deep in Victoria Langford's posture as her shoulders stilled and her gaze sharpened, no longer scanning the engine, but locking onto Marcus with a new intensity that did not belong to authority. It belonged to recognition trying to catch up with reality. And for a moment she said nothing, not because she had nothing to say, but because whatever she had been about to say no longer fit. And Marcus continued as if nothing had changed, placing each tool back into its case with quiet precision, metal meeting metal in soft, controlled clicks that echoed gently in the stillness. And the engine behind him continued to run, steady and confident, a low reminder that the outcome had already been decided. And the engineer leaned closer again, his voice barely above a whisper, but urgent now. That alignment he used. It is not standard, it is not even documented. And Victoria's eyes flickered slightly as she processed it, her mind moving quickly through layers of knowledge, experience, and control, searching for a place to file what she was seeing, and finding none. And that absence unsettled her more than failure ever had. Because failure she understood, this she did not. And she took one slow step toward Marcus, then another, closing the distance that had once felt insignificant, but now seemed filled with something heavier, something harder to cross. And when she spoke again, her voice had changed, still controlled, still measured, but stripped of the edge it had carried before. "Where did you learn to do that?" And the question hung in the air, not as a demand, but as something closer to a need for clarity. And Marcus paused, just for a second, his hand resting on the edge of the toolbox before he closed it, the latch clicking into place with a finality that matched his stillness. And he did not turn immediately, did not rush to answer, because he had learned long ago that answers given too quickly were rarely heard. And when he did turn, his expression remained calm, grounded, unchanged by the attention now focused on him. "I listen," he said simply, his voice even, carrying just enough to reach her without forcing its way through the room. And a faint crease formed between Victoria's brows, not from confusion, but from the realization that the answer was not incomplete. It was complete in a way she did not expect. And behind her, the engineer let out a quiet breath, as if confirming something to himself, and another voice further back added in a low tone, "That configuration, it resembles an early concept from a discontinued research model." And that was when the shift became undeniable, because Victoria knew those models. She had studied them, invested in them, watched them fail. And yet what she was seeing in front of her was not failure. It was refinement, execution, something that had been missing before. And her eyes returned to Marcus, searching more deeply now, past the surface, past the role she had assigned him, looking for a connection that explained the gap between what he appeared to be and what he had just done. And for the first time since she walked into the garage, she felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not doubt, not exactly, but the awareness that she had misjudged something fundamental, and Marcus did not fill the silence, did not offer more than what he had already said, because he did not need to. The proof was running behind him, steady and undeniable, and he reached for his worn jacket, lifting it from a nearby bench with the same quiet efficiency, slipping it on without hurry, as if this moment did not belong to him, as if it was already over. And that was when the senior engineer spoke again, louder this time, unable to hold it back any longer. "Victoria, if I am right, he is the one who designed the adaptive alignment theory we could never replicate." And the sentence landed fully this time, not hidden, not softened, and the room reacted in a way it had not before, not with noise, but with a collective stillness that carried understanding. And Victoria did not move, did not speak, her eyes fixed on Marcus as the realization began to take shape, slow but certain, and for the first time, she was not the one in control of what came next. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and precise. And for a moment no one moved. Not the engineers, not the interns, not even the camera drone still hovering silently above, because the sentence had changed the shape of the room in a way no one could ignore, and Victoria Langford stood completely still, her eyes fixed on Marcus Hale as if seeing him for the first time without the filter she had placed on him when he walked in, and the engine continued its steady hum behind him, a quiet, undeniable proof that did not need explanation. And Marcus did not react to the statement, did not turn, did not correct it. He simply adjusted the cuff of his jacket and reached for the worn strap of his tool bag, lifting it onto his shoulder with a motion so ordinary it felt almost out of place against the weight of what had just been said, and that contrast made it harder to ignore, not easier. And Victoria took a slow breath, the kind that did not show on the surface but shifted something deeper, because she understood exactly what the engineer had implied. She had read those papers, funded those prototypes, watched them fail in controlled environments with teams far more resourced than the man standing in front of her. And yet here he was, not presenting, not explaining, simply doing, and that gap between expectation and reality pulled at her in a way she was not used to. And she stepped forward again, closing the distance fully now, her voice quieter when she spoke, stripped of performance. "Marcus," she said, using his name for the first time, testing it as if it mattered, and he paused just slightly, enough to acknowledge that he heard her, but not enough to turn around. And that restraint shifted the balance again, subtle but clear, because for the first time she was the one waiting for a response, and it did not come immediately, and the engineer behind her spoke again, unable to contain the urgency. "We tried to replicate that alignment for 3 years, he said, his voice carrying now, not whispering anymore. "We never got it stable, not once." And a quiet ripple moved through the room as others processed it, connecting pieces they had not seen before, and Victoria's gaze did not leave Marcus, her mind moving quickly now, recalibrating, reassessing, because this was no longer about a repaired engine, it was about something she had overlooked entirely. And she took another step, stopping just behind him, close enough that her voice did not need to carry. "Why are you here?" she asked, and the question was not sharp, not accusatory. It was direct, searching, and Marcus finally turned his head slightly, not fully facing her, just enough that his profile caught the light, his expression unchanged, calm, grounded, and he answered without hesitation. "Because the engine was broken," and the simplicity of it landed harder than anything else had. Because it refused to engage with the narrative forming around him. It refused to elevate the moment into something else. And for a second Victoria almost responded, almost pushed further, but the words did not form the way she expected, because his answer did not give her anything to argue against. And the engine continued to run, steady, consistent, filling the silence with something real, something that did not depend on titles or assumptions. And Marcus adjusted the strap on his shoulder and took a step toward the exit, not rushed, not hesitant, just moving forward as if the path had always been clear. And that was when Victoria spoke again, quicker this time, the first hint of urgency breaking through her control. "Wait." And the word stopped him, not because it demanded to, but because it carried something different now, something closer to respect than authority. And he paused, still facing away, and the room held its breath once more, not in doubt, not in expectation of failure, but in anticipation of what would happen when someone who had always controlled the outcome realized, perhaps for the first time, that she no longer did. The word hung in the air longer than it should have, softer than anything Victoria Langford had said before, yet somehow heavier, and Marcus stopped mid-step, not turning yet, not moving forward either, just standing there with the strap of his tool bag resting across his shoulder, the engine still humming behind him like a steady pulse that refused to fade, and the entire room leaned into that pause again. But this time it was different, not tense, not skeptical, but aware that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. And Victoria took another step closer, the sound of her heels nearly silent now against the concrete, as if she no longer wanted to announce her presence. And when she spoke again, her voice was controlled but no longer distant. "I was wrong," she said, and the words felt unfamiliar even to her, like a language she had not used in a long time, and a faint ripple moved through the room. Not loud, not obvious, but present, because no one there had ever heard her say that before, not to anyone. And Marcus remained still for a moment longer before slowly turning, not sharply, not with surprise, just enough to face her, his expression unchanged, calm, steady, as if the statement did not alter anything for him. And that made it land even deeper, because there was no reaction to soften it, no acknowledgement to frame it, just quiet acceptance. And Victoria held his gaze, searching for something, anything that would give her footing again, but what she found was the same grounded stillness that had been there from the beginning, and it forced her to continue without it. "That engine, we could not fix it," she added, her words measured but carrying a weight she did not hide. "And you did." And Marcus glanced briefly toward the car, then back at her, a small movement that said more than a long explanation ever could, and the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full of everything left unsaid, everything being recalculated in real time. And one of the engineers shifted behind her, then stepped forward, unable to stay back any longer, his voice carrying now with a mix of respect and disbelief. "We have been studying that alignment for years," he said. "No one has been able to stabilize it." And Marcus listened without interruption, his posture unchanged. Because he had heard versions of this before, in different rooms, from different people, always after the fact, always when it was already done, and Victoria's eyes flickered again, absorbing each word, each confirmation, until the gap between what she had assumed and what stood in front of her became impossible to ignore, and she took a breath, slower this time, more deliberate, as if choosing her next words carefully, not out of control, but out of understanding. "You should not be here," she said, and the sentence could have sounded like dismissal in another moment. But now it did not. Now it carried something else, something closer to recognition, and Marcus tilted his head slightly, not questioning, just acknowledging the statement. And she continued, her voice steady but different. "Not like this." And for the first time since the engine started, there was no distance left in her tone, no separation between who she was and what she was saying, and the room felt it, every person, standing there aware that the balance had shifted completely. And Marcus looked at her for a long second, not measuring her words, not weighing them against anything, just seeing them for what they were. And then he gave a small nod, once, simple and final. "I know," he said, and the answer did not challenge her, did not accept anything beyond itself. It just existed, clear and grounded. And that was when the engine's steady hum seemed louder again, filling the space between them with something undeniable, something that no title or position could override. And Victoria's hand moved slightly at her side, as if she was about to say more, to step further into a conversation she did not fully control. But Marcus shifted his weight forward again, the movement subtle but decisive, and the moment tightened once more, not because of conflict, but because everyone in the room understood that whatever came next would not belong to her alone anymore. Marcus took that step forward, and it was enough to tell the room he had already decided something, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way people make choices that do not need approval. And the strap of his tool bag shifted slightly against his shoulder as he moved, the worn leather creasing under the weight like it had done 1,000 times before, and Victoria felt it immediately, that subtle shift, that sense of the moment slipping past her before she had fully caught it. And for the first time since she had walked into the garage, She moved without calculation, taking a half step after him, not enough to block his path, but enough to stay within it. And her voice came out softer than before, but clearer. "If you leave now, this ends here," she said, and the sentence carried more than its words. It carried the awareness that something larger had just begun and could just as easily disappear. And Marcus slowed, not stopping completely this time, but enough that the distance between them did not grow, and he turned his head slightly again, the same restrained motion as before, acknowledging her without giving the moment more than it had earned, and the engine behind them continued its steady hum, filling the silence with a reminder that what had been done could not be undone. And Victoria held his partial gaze, her expression no longer guarded, no longer constructed for others to read, but open in a way that felt unfamiliar even to her. "We built an entire division trying to understand that system," she continued, her words measured but no longer distant. "We failed." And the admission landed quietly, but it landed fully, because it was not directed at the room, not at her team, it was directed at him. And Marcus listened, his posture unchanged, grounded, as if the statement did not elevate him or diminish her. It simply existed, and that made it harder to ignore, and one of the engineers behind her stepped forward again, unable to contain the weight of what was unfolding. "Do you know what that means?" he said, his voice carrying now, not cautious anymore. "If that alignment is stable, it changes everything." And Marcus did not turn toward him, did not engage with the implication, because he had heard that tone before too. The moment when understanding catches up to action, when people begin to see potential instead of presence. And Victoria's eyes flickered briefly toward the engineer, then back to Marcus, because this conversation was no longer about the room. It was about the space between them, and she took a slow breath, steadying herself not out of control, but out of clarity. "I made a mistake," she said again, not repeating the earlier words, but deepening them, grounding them in something more real. And the room fell even quieter, if that was possible, because repetition in her voice did not sound like weakness, it sounded like intention. And Marcus finally turned a little more, not fully facing her, but enough that his eyes met hers directly now. And there was no challenge there, no judgment, just a calm that did not shift with the moment. And that calm made it clear that whatever she was trying to recover was not something he had taken, it was something she had misplaced. And she felt that realization settle in, steady and undeniable. And for a second, she almost smiled, not out of ease, but out of recognition, a small acknowledgement of something she had not expected to find in her own space. And then it faded, replaced by focus, because she understood what was at stake now, not just the engine, not just the contract, but the person standing in front of her. And she spoke again, slower this time, choosing each word with care. "Stay," she said, and the single word carried everything she could not yet say. And Marcus held her gaze for a moment longer, the engine's steady rhythm echoing softly between them, and then his eyes shifted briefly toward the exit, then back to her. And that movement, small as it was, told the room everything it needed to know, that he had a choice, that he always had one. And for the first time since the moment began, Victoria was not trying to control the outcome, she was waiting for it. The words stayed between them, simple and unforced, and Marcus did not answer right away, not because he was unsure, but because he did not rush decisions that mattered. And the engine's steady hum filled the space where a response could have been, grounding the moment in something real, something that did not bend to pressure or expectation. And Victoria held her position, not stepping closer, not retreating, just waiting, her eyes steady on his as if she had already accepted that whatever came next would not be hers to direct. And behind her the room remained silent, not out of fear or tension, but because no one wanted to interrupt what was unfolding, not anymore. And Marcus shifted his weight slightly, the strap of his bag settling against his shoulder as he looked past her for a brief second, not searching for approval, not measuring the room, just acknowledging the space he stood in. And then his gaze returned to her, calm, even, unchanged, and he spoke, his voice low but clear. "You do not need me to stay." And the sentence did not reject her request, it reframed it, placing the choice back where it belonged. And Victoria felt it immediately, that quiet redirection, and for the first time she did not push against it, she leaned into it, her breath steady as she answered, "I know." And the admission came without hesitation, without defense, because she understood now that this was not about necessity, not about filling a gap in her team. It was about something deeper, something she had overlooked entirely, and the realization settled in her posture, grounding her in a way that felt different from control. And Marcus watched her for a moment, not evaluating, not testing, just seeing. And then his eyes moved briefly toward the engine again, the soft rhythm still steady, still consistent, a quiet reminder of what had already been proven. And one of the engineers stepped forward once more, unable to remain silent any longer, his voice carrying a careful urgency. "If you leave, we lose this," he said, gesturing slightly toward the car, toward the system none of them fully understood. And Marcus glanced toward him, just once, a short acknowledgement that held no agreement, no resistance, just awareness. And Victoria did not turn to the engineer, did not let the room pull her focus away again, because she knew that argument would not reach him, not now. And she spoke again, slower this time, her voice steady and direct. "I do not want you to stay because we failed," she said, each word placed carefully. "I want you to stay because I was wrong." And the difference was clear, not just in meaning, but in weight. And it settled into the space between them with a quiet certainty that did not ask to be accepted. It simply existed. And Marcus held her gaze a moment longer, the silence stretching but not uncomfortable, just full, like something finding its shape. And then he took a small step forward, not away, not past her, but closer, closing the distance just enough that the conversation belonged only to them now. And his voice when he spoke was the same as before, calm, grounded, unchanged by everything around it. "Being wrong is not the problem," he said, and Victoria's eyes flickered slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition of something she had not fully considered. And he continued, not raising his voice, not shifting his tone. "What you do after is," and the sentence did not accuse, did not challenge. It simply placed the weight of the moment where it belonged. And Victoria felt it settle in, deeper than anything else that had been said, because it did not question her authority, it questioned her response. And for a second the room seemed to fall even quieter, if that was possible, as if everyone there understood that the conversation had moved beyond the engine, beyond the demonstration, into something far more difficult to navigate. And Marcus stepped back slightly then, restoring the small space between them, not distancing himself, just returning balance. And the engine continued its steady rhythm behind him, a constant, unwavering presence that made everything else feel temporary. And Victoria did not look away, did not break the moment, because she knew now that whatever happened next would define more than just this room. And for the first time, she was not trying to control it. She was choosing how to meet it. The sentence settled into the space between them, quiet but immovable, and Victoria did not respond immediately, not because she did not understand, but because she did, and that understanding required something from her she had not needed to give before. And for a moment the only sound left in the garage was the steady rhythm of the engine, smooth and consistent. A reminder that something real had already been proven without permission, without approval, and Marcus stood still, not pressing, not waiting in the way others did, just present, grounded in a way that made the moment feel clearer instead of heavier. And Victoria's hand moved slightly at her side before she brought it to rest, steadying herself not out of control, but out of choice. And when she spoke again, her voice carried no edge, no performance, just intention. "Then I need to do it right," she said, and the words were simple, but they held a weight that the room felt immediately, because they were not directed at the situation, they were directed at him. And Marcus watched her for a second, not measuring, not testing, just seeing whether the shift was real, and something in her posture told him that it was, not perfect, not complete, but real enough to stand on. And behind her the engineers exchanged brief glances, quiet and uncertain, because the moment had moved beyond anything they could influence. And Victoria took a step to the side, not blocking his path anymore, not holding him in place, but opening the space instead, a small movement that changed everything about what she was asking. And she continued, slower now, deliberate. "If you choose to walk out, I will not stop you." And the sentence landed differently than anything she had said before, because it removed control completely, leaving only the choice. And Marcus felt it, that shift from demand to respect, and his eyes moved briefly toward the open space she had created, then back to her. And for a second neither of them spoke, the silence stretching not from tension, but from clarity. And the engine behind them continued its steady hum, as if marking the time of the decision, and one of the engineers stepped forward again. But this time he stopped himself, the words catching before they could leave, because he understood now that this was not his place to speak. And Victoria held Marcus's gaze, not pushing, not pulling, just present. And that presence carried something new, something that had not been there before. And Marcus shifted his weight slightly, the strap of his bag settling again against his shoulder, and he took a small step forward, moving into the space she had opened, not past her, not away from her, but through the moment itself. And he stopped just short of the exit, turning his head once more, not fully, just enough to meet her eyes again. And when he spoke, his voice remained the same, calm and even, unchanged by everything around it. "You cannot fix what you do not see," he said, and the sentence was not directed at the engine. Not anymore. And Victoria's eyes held steady, the meaning landing without resistance, without defense. And she nodded once, small but certain, accepting it not as correction, but as truth. And Marcus watched her for a second longer, as if confirming something silently. And then he turned back toward the exit, his hand brushing lightly against the metal frame of the door as he began to walk. And the room did not move, did not speak, because they all understood that this was the moment that mattered. Not the repair, not the revelation, but the choice that followed it. And just as Marcus reached the threshold, just as the light from outside began to catch the edge of his jacket, the engine behind him shifted slightly, the rhythm changing in a way only a trained ear would notice, subtle but real. And Victoria's head turned instantly, her focus snapping back to the machine, the awareness immediate, because she understood now what that sound meant. And her voice came out without hesitation, sharper but not commanding. "Wait." And this time the word carried something different, not control, not urgency alone, but the recognition that the moment was not over yet. The change in the engine was slight, almost invisible to anyone who was not listening for it, a faint unevenness beneath the smooth rhythm, like a breath taken half a second too late. But Victoria heard it immediately, her body reacting before thought could catch up as she turned fully back toward the car, her eyes narrowing not in doubt, but in focus. And Marcus paused at the threshold, not stepping out, not turning yet, just still, because he had heard it too. Of course he had. And the room shifted again, the fragile sense of resolution dissolving into something sharper, something unfinished. And one of the engineers moved quickly toward the engine, leaning in with urgency. "It is drifting," he said, his voice tight with recognition. "The alignment is not holding." And the words rippled through the room, bringing back a familiar tension, but this time it felt different, not rooted in doubt of Marcus, but in the complexity of what he had done. And Victoria stepped closer to the engine, her hand hovering just above the frame, not touching, just feeling the subtle vibration that no longer matched the precision from moments before. And she spoke without looking back, her voice steady but edged with understanding. "It is the adaptive sequence," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "It needs stabilization." And Marcus exhaled quietly, the sound barely audible, as he turned back into the room, not with hesitation, not with obligation, but with the same calm decision he had carried from the beginning. And he walked toward the car again, each step measured, unhurried, the strap of his bag shifting slightly as he moved. And the room parted without being asked, giving him space not because of authority, but because of recognition. And Victoria stepped aside without hesitation, not out of habit, but because she knew exactly where she needed to be now. And Marcus reached the engine, his eyes scanning it once more, not surprised, not frustrated, just seeing it for what it was, a system that had not fully settled yet. And he set his bag down beside him, the soft thud grounding the moment. And one of the engineers began to speak. "We should shut it down before." But Marcus lifted a hand slightly, not sharply, not forcefully, just enough to pause the words before they formed. And the engineer fell silent, because the gesture did not demand attention. It held it. And Marcus leaned in, his fingers moving carefully along the same alignment point he had adjusted before, but this time slower, more precise, as if he was not just correcting, but refining. And Victoria watched closely, closer than before, her focus no longer divided, no longer filtered through expectation, but direct, absorbing each movement as if it mattered. And for a moment the room returned to that quiet stillness. But it was no longer fragile. It was grounded in something deeper, a shared awareness that what they were witnessing was not just skill, but understanding in motion. And Marcus adjusted one connection, then another, listening again, not to the noise, but to the space beneath it. And the engine responded subtly, the unevenness smoothing out, the rhythm aligning once more into something steady, something whole. And the shift was quiet, but it was undeniable, and Marcus did not step back immediately. He waited, just long enough to be sure, just long enough to confirm what he already knew. And then he straightened, wiping his hands once more on the cloth, the motion simple, familiar, grounding, and the engine continued to run, stable now, consistent in a way that did not waver. And Victoria let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her shoulders settling slightly as she looked at the machine, then at Marcus. And this time when she spoke, there was no distance left at all, no authority to hide behind, just clarity. "You did not have to come back," she said, and Marcus glanced at her briefly, then back at the engine, his expression unchanged. "It was not finished," he replied, and the simplicity of it landed again, steady and certain, and the room fell quiet, not because they did not understand, but because they did, and that understanding left no space for anything else. The engine settled into a rhythm so clean it almost disappeared, the kind of sound that did not demand attention because it did not need it, and Marcus stepped back again, giving it space, his hands lowering to his sides as the cloth rested loosely in his fingers. And this time, he did not move immediately, did not reach for his bag. He simply stood there for a moment, listening, confirming, finishing in a way that did not require an audience. And Victoria watched him closely, not the engine now, but him. The way he moved, the way he chose when something was complete without looking for approval, and something in that quiet certainty stayed with her, settling deeper than anything that had been said. And she took a slow step forward, stopping just beside the open hood, her eyes briefly scanning the system again before returning to Marcus. And when she spoke, her voice carried a steadiness that was different from before, not controlled, not guarded, just clear. "We built everything around being right," she said, the words measured but unfiltered. "And we still missed it." And the admission did not feel like a loss. It felt like a realization finally spoken out loud. And Marcus glanced at her, not surprised, not impressed, just acknowledging the truth as it was. And one of the engineers shifted behind them, then stepped forward, unable to hold back any longer. "If this works at scale," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity, "it changes production, cost, everything." And the weight of that statement moved through the room, not loudly, but deeply, because everyone there understood what it meant, and Victoria did too. But her gaze did not leave Marcus, because she knew now that what mattered was not the system, not the outcome, but the person who understood it in a way no one else did. And she took another breath, slower this time, grounding herself before she spoke again. "I said something earlier," she began, and for a brief second the room seemed to lean in, not out of curiosity, but because they remembered, and she did not avoid it, did not soften it. "I reduced you to a moment," she said, her voice steady, carrying just enough to be heard without reaching. "And I was wrong to do that." And the words settled into the space between them with a clarity that did not ask for forgiveness. It simply acknowledged what had happened, and Marcus listened, his expression unchanged, not dismissive, not accepting, just present. And that presence made the moment feel real instead of resolved. And Victoria held his gaze, not expecting anything in return, not waiting for validation, just standing in the truth of what she had said. And for a second nothing moved, the engine continuing its quiet, steady rhythm behind them, grounding the silence. And then Marcus gave a small nod, not as acceptance, not as agreement, but as recognition. And he reached down, picking up his tool bag again, the strap settling against his shoulder with a familiar weight. And Victoria did not step in front of him this time. did not try to hold the moment in place. She stepped aside again. But this time the movement was not about opening space. It was about respecting it. And as Marcus turned toward the exit once more, she spoke one last time, not loudly, not urgently, but clearly. "If you ever choose to come back," she said, "it will not be like this again." And the sentence carried no promise, no guarantee, just intent. And Marcus paused for a fraction of a second, just enough to acknowledge that he heard her, and without turning, he answered, his voice calm, even, unchanged. "That depends," he said. And then he stepped forward, moving toward the door as the light from outside caught the edge of his jacket. And behind him the engine continued to run, steady and complete, a quiet reminder that something had been fixed, but something else had only just begun. The door did not slam. It did not even make a sound. It simply closed behind Marcus with a quiet finality that felt heavier than any noise could have been. And for a long moment no one in the garage moved. Not the engineers, not the interns, not even Victoria. Langford, who stood exactly where he had left her, her gaze still fixed on the space where he had been, as if something in that absence still held weight. And the engine continued to run, smooth and steady, its rhythm filling the silence with something constant, something real. And it was that sound that finally pulled the room back into motion, one of the engineers stepping closer to the car again, this time not with urgency, not with doubt, but with careful attention, as if approaching something they no longer fully understood. And another followed, quieter, more deliberate, their voices low, measured, not the confident tones from before, but something more restrained, more aware. And Victoria did not join them immediately. She remained where she was, her posture still, her expression unreadable for a second longer before something shifted, subtle but clear, and she turned, not toward the engine, but toward the door, her eyes resting there just long enough to acknowledge what had changed, not in the room, but in herself. And then she moved, slow, deliberate, each step grounded as she approached the car, stopping just beside it, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the frame, feeling the steady vibration beneath her palm. And for the first time since the moment began, she did not look for flaws, did not search for confirmation. She simply listened, the same way he had. And the realization settled quietly, deeper than any statement, deeper than any admission, that the difference had never been the machine. It had been the way it was seen. And behind her one of the engineers spoke again, his voice steady but different now. "We need to document this," he said. And another added, "We need to understand how he did it." And Victoria closed her eyes for just a fraction of a second, not in dismissal, but in recognition. And when she opened them, her gaze returned to the engine, then moved across the room, taking in the people who had been so certain before. And she spoke, her voice calm, even, carrying just enough to be heard. "No," she said, and the single word stopped them, not sharply, not forcefully, but completely. And she continued, her tone steady, grounded. "We need to understand why we did not." And the sentence settled into the space with a quiet clarity that shifted the focus entirely. And no one argued, not because they could not, but because they understood. And the room fell into a different kind of silence, one that was not empty, but reflective. And Victoria remained there for a moment longer, her hand still resting against the car, feeling the steady pulse of something that now meant more than performance, more than success. And then she stepped back, straightening slightly, not returning to who she had been, but standing in something new, something less certain, but more real. And her eyes moved once more toward the door, the place where the moment had ended and begun at the same time. And she exhaled slowly, the breath steady, measured, and quiet. And the engine continued to run, not louder, not softer, just constant, a low, steady reminder that some things do not need recognition to be true, and some people do not stay long enough to be understood, but they leave something behind that changes everything. And in the reflection of the polished metal, Victoria saw it clearly for the first time, not the machine, not the room, but the space where certainty had been replaced with something far more valuable. And she did not look away.